guess I wanted to start by talking about why I decided to do this. And some of you may have been at the talk I gave on the Chautauqua, and when I was doing that, I was looking in the eccentrics, the Birmingham newspapers, and I was edging right up to the 30s in looking for information about the Chautauquas. And I started seeing information about the Depression, and I thought, like, wow, you know, really? I never really thought about the Depression in Birmingham, in a place like Birmingham as compared to Detroit, or, you know, what would it be like? And Birmingham always has kind of had sort of an image of exceptionalism, you know, like they are okay, even if other places aren't, they somehow get through. And I thought, well, you know, let's see what happened in Birmingham during the Depression. So that's what I'm doing. I want to thank George Averill, who was the editor of the Eccentric for about 40 years, for his wonderful stewardship of the paper and all the information he provided. And my methodology was to use the newspaper, and then I supplemented it with other things. But mainly I wanted to see what it would be like if you were just getting an impression of the Depression through reading the Eccentric in Birmingham. And my husband, Carol, is here to do the audio-visual, so I'm grateful to him for doing that. All right. Just to start out, give a very basic background. The Depression, you know, stock market, October 29th, 1929. Stock market crashes. Production of goods and services declines by 1/3. Unemployment, 25%. 7,000 banks failed. So in Detroit, what happened in Detroit, it was the 4th largest city, but it was probably the worst hit because it was such a manufacturing city. And because of the automobile industry, actually between 1929 and 1931, car manufacturing dropped from 5 million to 1.3 million cars. And so obviously that had a huge impact. And the picture here is because Detroit copied New York with the idea of the apples, selling the apples. So people who were veterans or who were residents of Detroit for at least a year were allowed to sell apples. And on the first day, 11,000 apples were sold. So the idea was, you know, most people can afford 5 cents. So a way of supporting people. And there were at times as many, I think 150 vendors, apple vendors. So that was, you know, an interesting strategy. But what about Birmingham? Birmingham, I want to set the stage by talking a little about the 20s. Because the 20s, the contrast between the 20s and 30s was so dramatic. In particular for Birmingham, but all over, of course. As we know in Detroit, we had in the 20s the Fisher Building, the Penobscot Building, the Book Cadillac, the GM Building, a building frenzy. And money was available, very available. People were flourishing, prosperous. It was quite a time. In Birmingham, there was the same kind of boom. Birmingham grew from 640 acres in the beginning of the 20s to 2,600 acres by the end of the 20s. And I find this remarkable. The population grew from 3,690 in 1920 to 12,000 by about 1929. I mean, that is just, it's a 200% growth in eight or 9 years. And now, does anybody know what our population is now? 20,000, about 20,000. So between 1930 and 2018, we've grown from 12,000 to 20,000. But in the 20s, we grew, you know, so rapidly, so fast. it was, you know, I knew we had grown, but not that quickly. There were 120 stores, 2 banks, 14 real estate offices, and 16 gas stations. So that tells you a lot right there about what was going on, doesn't it? You know, real estate, gas stations. People were driving. There was finally a cement road from Detroit all the way to Pontiac. It was about 12 feet wide, but it was a cement road. And in the 20s, people were still using horses and wagons, but of course they were also using cars, so it was that transition time. So this was the time when suburban development started, and people that hadn't been able to afford homes before could now. They were building more mass-produced homes. The idea of the real estate market was to give an opportunity to the average person to have their own home for the first time instead of being a renter. Now, Birmingham, up until this point, and from its founding, had been a city of a small town, a village, they called themselves, of middle class to upper middle class people. In fact, I should step back because the name Birmingham comes from, as most of you know, the fact that it was named after Birmingham, England, which was an industrial center, and the intent was for Birmingham to be an industrial center. But that went away really quickly in the early history. It didn't happen. What happened instead is that Birmingham became a residential community, a service area for the affluent summer homes of the Detroit rich and affluent who moved out, had summer homes like at Cranbrook and places like that, and used Birmingham as their service area. And the farmers used Birmingham as their service area. And after they retired, they moved into Birmingham. So it was a pretty middle-class place, upper middle-class place. There were some really wealthy people with ties to Birmingham in the 20s. And then when there was this building boom, of course, we have subdivisions coming that are bringing in a different kind of person, bringing in working auto workers, bringing in the people that had never been able to have this opportunity before. This is part of the building boom in Birmingham. That was the theater in 1927. This is the Municipal Building, 1929. And this is interesting. This is a rendering of the library that they wanted to build. And this is the bond, the bond vote in July 1926 to build the library. And you can see down here, it's not just to build the library, it's to build the municipal property for the municipal buildings, a firehouse and a library. And it was passed, and we have, the library was built, and Charles Shane had the idea of kind of a municipal area with the library on one side, the municipal buildings on the other, the park area in between. And it was lovely, and is lovely still. So, you want to do the map? Yeah. Here's a map. Now this is a later map. It's from the 70s or 80s, but you can see how Birmingham grew. The line straight down the middle is because it's from the book, so ignore that line straight down the middle. But the square, that's Birmingham. That's the village of Birmingham as it was, a square mile in the beginning, from 1818 until the 20s, really. And then all these other areas of development started being added. And a huge number of them were annexed into Birmingham around 1926. You probably can't read it, but it's most of them are the 26, around 26 that were added on. And I wanted to talk about one of them. No, this is what I wanted to do. This is a quote from from one of the real estate companies, one of the very big real estate companies here at the time. And this was their ad they had on their brochure for Birmingham. It said, "We are immune from the dull periods and consequent slump in prices that manufacturing towns are subject to when the factories shut down." Yeah. Okay, they're saying this in the 1920s. Little do they know, huh? So Birmingham thinks it's immune.
What are some of the dividing, like Adams is there right before the last box, and then what's over on the other side?
Over here?
Yeah.
Well, Southfield is, let's see, the square. There's the river and Quarton Lake, going through Quarton Lakes right there. This is Lincoln right here. That's Quarton, or Big Beaver, up there at the top. And Maple in the middle, right here. And Adams, and this is Woodward. Of course, right, the angled one. And that was that went around, that was the bypass, Hunter, which is now Woodward, because this is now Old Woodward. That's changed. So.
And then where's Adams?
Adams, where's Adams? I'm looking for Adams.
Way over there.
Adams is right on the side there.
Right here? It's hard for me to read it.
Gotta be further over, right before the box.
Ought to be.
And that rectangle that's just to the side of the square,
Yeah, oh, in here.
yeah, is part of Birmingham, but it's where the page divides, just to the left.
Right here?
Yeah.
Should be right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and all this area was added in 26. All of this. But this area in particular down here, was called Eco City. And I'm going to talk about that a little later here. Okay, so when I started with the paper, I started in 1929 in October, and of course there was no mention whatsoever of the crash. It's a local paper. They don't talk about anything that isn't local. So I'm like, isn't there anything here? No, nothing. And there's very little mention of anything to do with the Depression at first. The first real mention was in December, and in December there was a discussion of the possibility of having a welfare department, which certainly would suggest that you know, there was an inkling here that there was going to be something, there was going to be a need. And then in February 1930, what we see, which was a surprise to me, but the city manager's salary was raised from $5,000 to $5,600. Plans were announced to build the city garage and heating plant. And in March, the village hired its own village nurse. So there were 10 new homes being built, 2 new commercial buildings. So things were looking pretty good. So in June, that's when things started to look a little bleaker because the taxes weren't coming in. The typical taxes were not coming in the way it was anticipated because, of course, people at this point were unemployed or they were starting to feel the pinch. And there was the first local business suicide of a businessman that was reported in the paper. His name was Krull, Krull, I think.
What kind of a store did he have? What kind of a business?
Pardon?
What kind of a business did he
I
have?
don't know. I can't tell you. But it called him a local businessman who suicided. And there was, after that, a regular report of suicides. However, often they were reported as not as financial, but as health issues. People suiciding because of health issues, which made me wonder, was it health issues? Could be, could be either. But okay, and another thing that starts becoming a topic in the paper at this time is zoning. And when you look at the map and you see all this growth, you can see where zoning might start becoming a concern. It's sort of seems like almost out of control growth, and hard for a city government to keep up on that. And some of the things that were talked about were restricting multi-family housing. Where should that be allowed? And borders, how many borders would people be allowed to have? It's pretty common to have borders back then. Lots of people had borders. Teachers would board with families. People from the country would board with people in the city so they could go to school or their kids could go to school. At the time, I believe it was restricted to 5 borders for a household. But the other thing was that this is a quote from the paper: "Birmingham today is not the segregated village it was a few years ago." Segregated seems like an odd word in 1930, and I don't think it referred to race at all. I think it referred to class, to diversity, to the fact that we have these other subdivisions that with more modest housing coming in, and that it's changing the nature of the community. And that's where I want to stop and talk a little about the Eco-City story. This area below Lincoln was Eco-City. It cut across Woodward to this side and that side. It's where, for those of you who live around here, Chapin, Ruffner, Benneville, where those streets are, south of Lincoln, east of Woodward, and west of Woodward. And that was called the Woodward Subdivision. And it was started in 1921. And this was the ad. This was the promotional material for the Woodward Subdivision. It says, low prices, lots, and moderate priced homes go well in hand. And it said, go out today, select your home site. Take a card which is attached with a price and the terms in plain figures. Tear off the card and present it to the salesman in the Birmingham office or on the property. And start now. Better to invest in land than to invest in landlords. And these are your salespeople at the Woodward office. It was down south of Lincoln on Woodward. And my feeling looking at those guys is I don't think I'd want my daughter to marry them. but and these are two of the models at the top that were available. They had a whole lot of different models of houses, and this is Ruffner Street down at the bottom, as it was at the time. And
If you see a single-story house on Ruffner, those are Eco-City houses. Everything that's 2 or more stories are
now
replaced.
Now it's so replaced by tear downs and rebuilds that you can almost not find the houses anymore. But what happened is, so by 1926, there were over 300 houses there. And they were, the people that lived there were a mix of people, but a lot of auto workers type people, but also You know, anybody, you could buy a lot and build your own house. You didn't have to pick one of their models. You could buy the lot and do what you wanted, and you did see some two-story houses and some diversity in there. But these were not in Birmingham in the 1920s at first. They were in Bloomfield Township, which encompassed Birmingham, but not in Birmingham. So they didn't have to follow any kind of Birmingham restrictions. But once they developed, and people started moving in, one of the problems was that the children, they built Pierce School then for the children, which was down in that neighborhood. But in middle school, in junior high, what it was then, they would go to Barnum, which was up north of Lincoln. And in 1920, I think it was 1925, there were 15 cases of typhoid fever and among the children. And what people thought was that it was because of the unsanitary conditions in Eco City, because a lot of the people had outhouses and they weren't hooked up to the water system. And so the people down there in Eco City actually were interested in being part of Birmingham because they wanted some of the services that you would get in Birmingham that you didn't get just being in the township. So they had applied to be part of Birmingham, and it was quite a discussion about what was the right thing to do. But one of the things that the Birmingham realized is that with this typhoid and such, it would be far better to have these incorporated and annexed, I think, as part of the city, so that they could then be required to meet certain regulations. So that in 1926, the Eco City was annexed into Birmingham. So the reason that's so important for the Depression is that these were people who were doing really well in the 20s, but of course when the Depression came, they were the first ones to be laid off too, because they tended to be auto workers or have lower, not lower jobs, but skilled jobs in the industrial sector. So Birmingham's idea of itself as not being exposed to the manufacturing issues was, erroneous. They had to deal with that. So, okay. Okay. Jane McKee is here, and I talked to her because her family was here, and she was a little girl during the Depression, and she said, don't forget, she said, that it wasn't just those Eco City people. She said her dad used to call them the top hats with holes in their shoes. And the top hats with holes in their shoes were the very well-off people in the community who weren't doing so well during the Depression at all, as it turned out, had lost a lot of money in their investments, and were struggling. So in December 1930, there are 55 able-bodied men out of work in Bloomfield Township, and 47 of them are in the village of Birmingham. Okay, 30 families are receiving welfare. Now this period seems to be, based on my reading of the paper, the real period of decline, the real crisis period that Birmingham is sinking into, because by September 31, which is 9 months later, what we read in the paper is that there are 300 to 400 unemployed men in Bloomfield Township in 9 months now. And there are 130 families on welfare rather than 30. So in that 9 months, things just went. But ironically, or sadly, during that same 9 months, in December 1930, the city had actually hired a welfare worker to help with the situation. But in September, when all these figures jumped up, they laid off the welfare worker. Because as the figures jumped up, the taxes went down, they had no money to pay a welfare worker. So that's when things really got rough, I think. The city budget was cut by 1/3, but they were only getting about 1/3 of the taxes from people. And I should stop and say the tax collection is a little complicated. John probably understands this more than I do. But as much as I can understand, the village of Birmingham before 1933 was in Bloomfield Township, and Bloomfield Township paid the county and state taxes and for everybody in Bloomfield Township, and they charged the village of Birmingham a fee for collecting those. And also the Bloomfield Township paid for certain services, and they did pay for welfare. I mean, that was supposed to be their responsibility, not the village's responsibility. So although the village had made an attempt, it was clearly the township's responsibility to take care of welfare and certain other things. And the school was separate again, but the township collected the school taxes too. And the schools were a separate tax. So at the same time that all this was happening, the same kind of thing was happening with the schools. I mean, their taxes were just plummeting. And you know, I would think they plummeted even more, because if you didn't have children, or if you had to pick between which tax you were going to pay, anyway, the school taxes seemed to really, really drop. So the schools, at the time we had Baldwin High School, we had Barnum Junior High, we had Adams, Quarton, and Pierce. That was the school system. And at first, what they did for coping is practice some rigid economies. But then that wasn't working too well, and they started borrowing. They refinanced their bonds for a longer period of time. They cut the school year by 2 weeks. Things were pretty bad. Then in 1933, Governor Comstock, the governor of Michigan, closed all the banks in Michigan for a week in February for a bank holiday. Oh, and you know what I forgot, didn't I? I know, I'm making him crazy. I forgot. In June 1931, the first bank in Birmingham closed. It was the first time a bank closed in Birmingham, and that was first state bank closed. And it just closed, you know, overnight. Closed. According to the paper, according to George Averill, editor of the paper, it had great gobs of insolvent collateral. It opened for 1 day, and people were allowed to take out 5% of their money, which is clearly not very much money. I was talking, and I have permission to mention him to Heartland Smith about this. And he's still mad. He's still mad because he had $82.72 at age 7 in the bank, and he never got it back. Never has, never will. Apparently the banks would give out little piggy banks for the kids and encourage them to fill them up and then bring them to the bank, and then they'd open an account for them and they could save money. Well, that's a lot of money at that time. And the other thing was that what happened with First State, and there it is, you recognize that building, those of you in Birmingham? That's where Starbucks is now. Yeah. Maple and Woodward. Yeah, First State Bank. The officials who ran the bank, one of them, according to my sources, knew that the bank was going to close. I mean, not a surprise if you're an official of the bank, so removed all his money before it closed and decided to buy a gas station. in Birmingham. But everybody in Birmingham apparently knew that he did this, so nobody would buy any gas. So, and that gas station was bought eventually by Jane McKee's father, who owned a couple of other gas stations in town. And so, you know, it really didn't work out too well for him. And the other thing, the other, the other institution that I know about that was really hurt was the library. The library had $1,000 in that bank, and they lost it and never got it back. And that bank never opened again, you know, that was it. People got 5% out, and that was it. That was the end.
That's kind of crazy, because didn't the manager usually own the bank? Somebody should have sued him if he took all the money out.
Well, I don't think there was probably, you know, much money there. I mean, by the time, I'm not sure if you had sued them if there would have been money to get, because all the bank's investments, you know, when you put your money in the bank invests it in their own investments. And I don't think they've done a very good job. So, but then going back to the First National Bank had banks in Detroit and other places. And First National had a bank in Birmingham. That was the second bank in Birmingham. But when Governor Comstock closed all the banks in Michigan in February 1933, so did First National, of course, close. And this I found at the History Museum, and I thought it was pretty interesting. This is a check that was returned to the person who wrote it. It was not cashed by the bank. And you can see, which is also interesting, it's $2.50, and it's made out to Consumers Power, which would be nice, wouldn't it? And the person whose check that happens to be, and again I have permission to show that, is Hartland Smith's father. And this is the back of the check, and what you can see on there, it says canceled, and you can see it's the Reserve Bank of Chicago, Detroit branch, because the Reconstruction Finance Corporation then came in eventually in the first few weeks and kind of took over the banks and decided when and if they could open again. And so that was their stamp on the back of the check, which he wrote in February but didn't receive back until sometime in March. The other interesting thing about that I didn't know, but maybe people that grew up in Michigan do, is that Michigan took their bank holiday before Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday. So he was first to do it, and then New York apparently called Roosevelt, the New York people, you know, and said, hey, Michigan's done this and the whole country needs to do this, and Roosevelt did it. So a week later, the whole country was, the banks were closed. So now in Birmingham, getting back to Birmingham, there's no banks. And all people have is what they have, you know, the money in their pockets. So 1933, February, beginning of 1933, no banks. Of course, some people had banks in Detroit, money in banks in other places. The very affluent, you know, some people were in way better shape than others. But I think it's important to remember that even the people who kept steady jobs through the Depression were experiencing pay cuts, severe pay cuts often. Hart's father had a steady job as a accountant or auditor with Oakland County all through the Depression, but because his salary kept being cut over and over again, they ended up they lost their house, they lost their business, they had to move to an apartment in Pontiac, you know, so it was very, very hard. In 33, the city for its own staff made its fourth pay cut. The schools, they had to go to paying their teachers with scrip. And scrip was our IOUs. So what they did in the 1932-33 school year, they were only getting a third of school taxes paid in. So they cut the pay of all the teachers by 15%, and then 50% of what they did get, they got in scrip. IOUs that presumably after the Depression they would be able to make cash in, perhaps. The idea was that merchants would accept the IOUs, hopefully, and the scrip, and they could get by. And married teachers, they were all women there then basically, married teachers only could work half-time. So one of the problems was that some of the merchants didn't accept scrip. And that was, made it very difficult. In the summer, the teachers would, move back in with their families or something like that, because there weren't other jobs for them to get. It was very difficult. Okay, so the Depression had a big impact on Birmingham. It took a little longer for it to get here, but it certainly did. I want to talk about some of the coping strategies that the community used, different things that worked or helped to get through it. One of them, and the one that I think is the most interesting and most unique to Birmingham, was the presence of the community house. The community house, as all of you, is there anybody here who doesn't know what the community house is? I mention everybody does. Started in 1923, way before the Depression, or in the 20s. And the way it started was that that the minister, the priest at St. James Episcopal Church, and that was the original church, which the church now is in the same location, but it looks very different. The minister, Charles McCurdy, according to what I've read, told his parishioners that they needed to, if they were true missionaries, they needed to extend themselves beyond the church to the community, and that Birmingham was their town and they should look to that. And so a group of women led by Ruth Shane, who was the wife of Charles Shane, who ran the drugstore and was a leader in the town, a group of women, and that's Ruth Shane much later in her career, with a portrait of her that's at the community house. A group of women decided what they were going to do, and what the community needed was some kind of community center. So the church assisted them and helped them purchase a house at the corner of Chester and Maple. I think it was, no, Bates and Maple, a white house at the corner of Bates and Maple. And they turned this house, they raised money from their friends, and they canvassed door to door. They raised $7,000, I think, canvassing friends and having fundraisers and doing whatever they could do. And they redid this house and turned it into a community center, and they had a hostess, a resident hostess, who was there morning, noon, and night. And her name was Mary Griffith, and apparently she was much loved in the community and was there for about 10 years. And she was just there, to greet you if you came to the community house. And they saw the community house as two things, I think, really. A center of philanthropy, they called it. A place where you could get help. And secondly, as a place, a meeting place, a social meeting place. So they got like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and people like that to do their meetings there, the Rotary. People were meeting there, and the Village Players, who have their own little theater now in Birmingham, started there, started at the community house. They encouraged all kinds of things like that, and there were a lot of, which I'm not sure quite what this means, private parties. I don't know if they were paid rent for private parties, or if they just said, come on in if you want to have a party, you know, feel free, I don't know. But there were a lot of private parties, according to Ruth Shane. So it was successful. It was crowded, and this is for the next level here. What they decided is they needed a bigger place, and this was still the 20s, and they started raising money. They got, let's see, how many people? They got several people, a group of people to pitch in $1,000 each. 10 people pitched in $1,000 each. And they bought a larger house, a larger piece of property where they tore down the house. And ultimately raised enough money to build the community house as we know it today, pretty much. I mean, it's been added to, and in that location. And as you can see from this headline, when it opened, 5,000 to 7,000 people were there on St. Patrick's Day in 1930. And they managed to get it kind of just squeak through with the Depression breathing down people's backs. And Henry Ford attended. It was a very big deal. And Hudson's furnished the entire community house. It was quite something, you know, it's hard to imagine now, Carol and I were talking, that something would, like that, an opening of something in your town would happen, and half the town would be there. You know, that was, there wasn't the competition, I guess, for other things to do. You know, people were very engaged in the community. It was more of a looking inward rather than looking outward. One of the things that was said, that the community house made the point, and they make it on their website today, is that it was non-sectarian, non-partisan, and non-exclusive. And as the community began to trust that that was the case, they got more and more people coming. And when I'm reading that, and I'm also thinking eco-city, and I'm thinking those things are a little related in some ways, because I think there was like two different coping strategies going on. One was circle the wagons, you know, do zoning, do things to protect the community. And the other strategy was kind of more of this embracing strategy, that we have to embrace this new community, and we have to be there and serve it as it needs to be served. And what's interesting is that the community house saw itself as, they donated themselves to the city. I mean, they saw themselves as not private, but completely, we're for the city. Whatever the city wants to use us for, whatever Birmingham wants us to use us for, that's fine. And Birmingham, through the Depression, would be, when you read, saying things like, well, our welfare workers going to work out of the community house. All our welfare stuff is going to be out of the community house. We're going to do this and that out of the community house. So the village used it as theirs. And the community house was happy to do that. They saw that as their mission, for sure. So I think that's something really kind of special about Birmingham and the Depression, that they had that. I'll read Let me see if I can find it. It was completely donations and completely volunteers. And I found their 1935 report of what they accomplished in 1935, which would have been over the very worst of the Depression in Birmingham, but still very bad. 1935 summary at the community house: 66,334 visits, 827 meetings, 13,130 meals served, entirely based on donations and volunteers. 122 Thanksgiving baskets, 155 Christmas baskets, and according to George Averill in the paper, the most important thing they did was provide an employment clearinghouse. And people could go there and they knew what jobs were available, they matched people up to jobs. So that's what they did. And every year they had a fund drive, as they still do. Okay, the banks. What happened? What did the banks do to cope? Well, Birmingham was a little lucky in that regard, at least it seems that way to me, because 3 months after the bank closed, after First National closed, 3 months there were no banks whatsoever. 3 months afterwards, Senator James Couzens, who was the senator for Michigan, one of the senators for Michigan, had built the Wabeek building in downtown Birmingham where he had his office. And he decided he would open a bank. So he did. He opened a bank, and obviously he was said to have had $40 to $60 million in his of wealth. So he was able to get together what he needed to open a bank, and the finance corporation, the government required that you have 150 subscribers and $60,000, which the Reconstruction Finance Corporation would match. And he did that. And he was also able to help out First National, which was closed. And although they never opened again as a viable bank, he bought out all their good money that they had at 100%, and they were able to pay out to some of their customers, and the customers that had accounts there ended up getting about 50 or 60% of their money before the end of the Depression. Even though the bank was, the finance corporation never let them open again as a bank. An interesting just aside about Couzens is that, for one thing, they said he used the bank mostly for his own benefit, his own money. But he, one of the biggest clients of the bank was Father Coughlin. So he had all his money there, or the money he was caretaking. James Couzens was a really interesting man, and I just wanted to stop and say a little about him because his estate was Wabeek, which is now a subdivision, but the estate is still there, I guess the house, out in Bloomfield. So Birmingham, once he retired from his business interests in Detroit and from being mayor of Detroit, which he was for 2 terms, he was in this area. This made sense for him to be out here. He's one of those stories. He came from Canada at age 18, and he started as a railroad car checker. I don't know what a railroad car checker is, but it's a pretty humble job, I think. And some businessman, whose name I wasn't familiar with, noticed his good work, hired him as a clerk, And from there, he moved up, and he ended up being vice president under Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company. So, you know, that was a pretty mercurial rise. But then he and Henry had a falling out, and Henry bought him out. And so he left the auto industry, and he got involved in politics. And he was mayor, and then he became senator. And he was a great philanthropist. And in 1929, he donated 20 million, he donated, I believe, no, $10 million to the Children's Fund. He started a children's fund in Detroit. And this was right at, you know, on the cusp of the Depression, so it was good timing. And it was money to be spent for a variety of children's charities. And it had to be used within 25 years. That was part of his requirement, that it had to be spent within 25 years. And he continued to add to that. And he was an interesting man because he was a Republican, and he was in the Senate, voted twice as a Republican, but in 1936, he had supported Roosevelt. He thought Roosevelt's New Deal ideas were great, which wasn't what a lot of Republicans thought. And so, you know, he was sort of in a difficult situation with his party, and he was debating whether he should run again, and he did, but he ran as a Republican, who supported Roosevelt, and he lost. And shortly after that, he had been in very poor health. He died. But an interesting story, I think. And his life sort of moved in and out of touched Birmingham with the Wabi Building and the bank, and in different ways. And his favorite daughter, Madeline, lived in Birmingham with her family. Okay. So the banks, that's what happened with the banks. So we have the community house as the coping strategy. We have a bank opening, which was helpful. We have the schools mainly surviving because finally the state had to step in. In 1933, the state came through with $28,000 and then another $10,000 to keep the schools going. And I suspect, I didn't go beyond 35, but I suspect that was the beginning of a very different way of financing the schools, not just depending on local taxes. And the League of Women Voters, caravans from all over different communities in Oakland County, caravan to Lansing to plead with the governor for money for the schools. And that is Baldwin High School, which was built with Martha Baldwin's money, some of it. And unfortunately, we no longer have. Okay, how else did they cope? Well, another interesting thing they did is that the city decided to separate itself from Bloomfield Township and become independent. And that was voted down the first time around. It was very controversial because the debate was, would they save money? Would it cost them more? Would it cost them less? You know, how is this going to work out? And finally, the conclusion was they would save money. They would have to do their own welfare, which it seems to me the community house took a bit of a load off their shoulders with that. But they wouldn't have to pay some of the money they paid to the township for certain services that the township provided. So that's what they did. In 1933, they split off and became a village, separate from the township. Okay, What else? Well, the obvious thing, by 33, Roosevelt's programs started coming into the community. So the federal programs came in and made a huge difference all over the country, but including in Birmingham, so that in November, the Civic Works Administration funded in Birmingham people, welfare recipient, 57 welfare recipients hired. And they focused on park development, school repairs, and sewer projects where workers made pipes. 180 were employed by the end of the year, dropping unemployment in the village by 70%. So by the end of 1933, things were looking a lot better. And then later on, of course, that morphed into the WRA, and that, or the WPA, the Work Projects Administration. And our post office is a product of the Works Project Administration. And so is this mural inside the post office that's still there, even though, yes, the post office, as people who live here know, is no longer owned by the post office. It's owned by a private company. But the agreement was they would keep the mural, and they have. And it was done by an artist from Royal Oak, Carlos Ortiz, I think. And this is where it's being restored or cleaned or something in this picture, but we like this picture. Oh, and the third remaining object that we got from the Works Progress Administration was in the library. There's hanging a kind of a wrought iron gate of 2 children, and a gate that's right when you walk in, and that was a Works Progress Administration. It's downstairs project thing. So that was, I have to say, I have written down here, it's the age of acronyms. That was. We have the CWA, the NRA, the FERA, the CCC, and the WPA. And I decided not to talk about each of those or try and distinguish them, but they all helped. Okay, so this is the library, built in the late 20s, voted on by the people. And what happened with the library? Well, the library suffered, but one of the things that was good that happened to the library is that since people had no money, they came to the library, you know. So the patronage, half the citizens in Birmingham, in the Bloomfield Township, were library patrons. And let's see my figures here. 64, in 1928, the circulation was 64,000. By 1932, it was 112,000. During the Depression, they only had 1 librarian, 1 page, and 1 custodian. And our director laughed at me and he said, well, I wish I was lucky enough to have 1 full custodian now. Well, that's what he said. The adults were using the library more, but the big problem with the library is, okay, they had this beautiful building, and people wanted to go to the library and use it, but the books, they had no money for books. So a group of people organized a Friends organization. It hasn't been continuous, unfortunately, so it's not the Friends organization now, but there was a big gap in between with no Friends organization. But they organized a Friends organization and they fundraised. And they raised enough to buy 25 books. And so what they did with the 25 books, yeah, not very many, but what they did is they rented them out. And after the book was paid off, it was free. So they had rental shelf, and it was, I think, 10 cents. But once the book had been paid off, enough people had rented it, it moved to the free shelf. So it worked really well. And in fact, I don't know how long they had rental books here, but a long time, until relatively recently. I remember rental books here. It was a good, but back then it was a coping strategy, a move of desperation, and it really worked. So they ended up building up their collection. And then in 1935, they were able to hire a children's librarian. And she started the first storybook groups. And I have read that at the first storybook group, 400 children came, which, but it was a wonderful thing. So besides that, another interesting story about how coping was with sports or recreation. That would be a good way of dealing with this, just not dealing with it, being distracted by good stuff. And in 1930, the Barnum Junior High, which is no longer there, had added a swimming pool. And the swimming pool was to be used by the community as well as the schools. And there it is. That's a picture from the 1950s. But when the swimming pool opened, okay, let me find this here, opened July 3rd, 1930. The men and women swam separately. Men could be nude. The women, of course, wore suits, but they were cautioned, which I thought was interesting, not to wear wool suits, because wool bathing suits would get lint in the filters. But what happened with the pool, it was terribly affected by the Depression because the schools couldn't afford to keep it open. So after that first year, in 1930, the next year, they opened it, then they closed it because they couldn't afford it. And then they finally decided to open it and charge 25 cents admission to go. And then finally, after raising funds, in 33, they opened the pool for free again. And on the first day, there were 1,300, in the first 3 days, there were 1,300 patrons. So, you see how much these community resources were used, which is so interesting to me. Also, of course, there were sports, and Royal Oak and Birmingham were the big rivals. And in football, there was a game at Pierce School on Thanksgiving Day that was attended by 3,000. So sports were really popular. And as I'm sure people in this room know well more than I do about, those were good years for the Tigers. 35, they won the series. And that made a huge difference in morale, I think, to have things like that to focus on and to share the joy of. And also the Red Wings and also the Lions all won in 35, all won their national, which was pretty amazing. Another couple of things I wanted to mention. How's our time? Are we okay? Yeah, I'm almost done. One of the things that developed during that period that we still have today is the Halloween parade. And the reason the Halloween parade in Birmingham developed was not just, it was Charles Shane's idea, but the reason behind that sort of is that if you're reading the paper, as I was, the year before on Halloween, this is in 90, the first parade was in 34. In 33 on Halloween, 100 young males in the village of Birmingham were arrested for misbehaving on Halloween night. And they took them all to the Municipal Building. And, we're going to really, I don't know, I'm sure they didn't all fit in jail, but they read them the riot act, and the town was very unhappy. So, but the nice thing is, the next year, they came up with a pretty good solution which was keep everybody busy You know, have a dance, have entertainment, have a parade, have things for people to do, keep them out of trouble. So that's what they did, and we've had the Halloween parade ever since. Another big thing that happened, in 1931, the Grand Trunk Railroad opened in April. The line had moved over from where Hunter Woodward is now over to where it is now, and the station was built. Our wonderful Big Rock, now it's Big Rock, was there, and there was a huge event, parade, everything. So that was a big thing that happened at the time. And then I just wanted to finish mentioning a few just acts of individual kindness or corporate kindness that I ran across along the way. One was that J.L. Hudson's furniture at the community house, they told the community house they didn't need to pay for it until after the Depression, you know. So, and the community house was very nice. The city told city workers that they could, that the city would pay their utility bills. They didn't have to pay their utility bills. A lot of merchants accepted scrip, and the ones that accepted it built up lifelong loyalty because, you know, people were desperate. Teachers, people that had no money, they had scrip. There was a lot of bartering. Mrs. Yaw was Madeline Cousins. She was Cousins' favorite daughter. She paid to light the Christmas tree. So that was nice. Heartland Smith's dad, what he did, he had a niece who was a teacher in Pontiac, and all she had was scrip. So he had a car that needed fixing, and he found a person in Pontiac who would accept scrip. So he took his daughter, he took the teacher's scrip to use for the car, and he gave her the money that he would have used. So, Claire Cummings, Milky the Clown. Milky the Clown went to Adams School, went to the Adams School with Heartland Smith, and when he was a young boy, he gave he couldn't have been more than, I don't know, 10 or 11. He gave a fundraising performance at the school. He was already, you know, going in that direction to be a theatrical person. And he raised money for the Milk Fund. And the Milk Fund was, you know, that the kids got the milk, the little cartons of milk at school every day, and you didn't have to pay for it. And actually the Milk Fund also was that you could get every child under 18, they could go to either a certain places, and later it was the stores, and get 1.5 quarts of milk a day. So allocated for each child. But the thing that what Hart said is then he went home and he said that what he and his dad would do was walk along the railroad line and gather coal to use in their in their furnace to keep warm. So, you know, here he's performing at school and then he's going out and collecting coal. So, you know, times were tough. So I think that that's it.